Ayurveda is recognizing 6 stages of illness. And this is quite important because Ayurveda is very rare in this case, understanding this degree of subtlety of where illness actually begins. And this is why working in such a way as we do with the cleanse, we can address what Ayurveda senses would become an illness before it actually starts to affect the body. And this is the ideal, working with prevention rather than having to try to cure. And so we start by understanding the first stage, accumulation. This is where imbalance starts. It's where all imbalance and all ill health will begin. And it will always be because of poor digestion. And what affects digestion, that stress, that running around, not eating properly, not chewing properly, not having the right food, not using our senses properly, not adjusting to the seasons, not adjusting to the time of day or bedtimes and all these things that help, will cause disruption in our digestion. And so that accumulation phase is where most people ignore the problems because it doesn't feel like a really big deal. Vata imbalances will lead to Pitta and Kapha imbalances. So Vata is dominant. It is the first dosha to go out of balance because it's responsible for movement, because it's responsible for the central nervous system. Vata allows you to digest. It allows you to move hormones through the body. It allows you to circulate the blood. That energy of Vata is there in everything that stimulates the actions of the body. And when Vata is out of balance, it will lead to an imbalance with Pitta, meaning the body regulation through digestive fire or through the temperature of the body, through the thyroid, for example. And then Kapha imbalances, meaning that there's an excess of phlegm because there's too much cold and damp in the body, or an excess of accumulation in the circulatory system, for example, as I mentioned, for example, amyloid plaque that can build up in the arteries, this kind of thing. And all of it is starting because of these minor, everyday little things that we don't really pay attention to. So during the cleanse especially, we're going to put a lot of attention on how to adjust our lives, still living our lives and still enjoying what we're doing, but with a much more mindful way of understanding what we need for good health. So Vata's domain, or the seat, if you like, of Vata, is the colon. And so everything, we could also say, everything begins in the colon. All disease, all disruption begins in the colon. And science is now clear about this. Remember that what I'm describing here from Ayurveda's point of view is thousands of years old. And really in the last 15 or 20 years, Western research, I can't quite say Western medicine because it takes a while for medicine to catch up to the research, but certainly biological research is showing us a lot about how much the gut impacts our overall health. The bacteria in the colon are extremely important for our overall health balance, and the elimination of food through the colon is extremely important. And if the colon is not eliminating properly, it's going to perforate, and you end up with what is called leaky gut. This will affect the colon as well as the small intestine. And then those toxins end up recirculating through the body from the place where they're supposed to be eliminated. And so there's a vicious circle going on where the body is trying to eliminate and at the same time intoxicating itself and overburdening the organs of elimination. And all of that because the Vata domain has been upset. Pitta's domain is the intestine, so the small intestine. Pitta is also responsible for the liver, so the processing of bile. Another way of describing Pitta is bile, actually. It's what breaks down the food. If ever you've been ill enough to be coughing up bile, you know that it has a very bitter and a very hot quality. And those are the qualities of Pitta. So we can also see that in the types of food that we eat. And if we eat too much bitter, too much hot food, or heating food, we also imbalance Pitta, it becomes too intense. So when Pitta goes off balance, then we have problems of inflammation. And the inflammation can spread from the digestion all the way through the body into the joints, for example. Kapha's domain is in the stomach. So Kapha Of course, all of these have aspects of imbalance throughout the whole body, but these are the seats of each of these doshas. And kapha is in the stomach. And the stomach is what? It's water. It's full of moisture, and that's the kapha, the predominant energy. And that kapha energy is where that assimilation of nutrition starts. So having this digestive fluid with the heat of pitta and the movement of vata is extremely important. And having all three in balance is extremely important. So if we imagine that, for example, you have a problem with, for example, excess mucus in the body, excess fluid, we end up with colds, head colds. We might end up with hay fever. We might end up with mucus in different ways. The mucus can be in the nasal cavity or in the ear canal, or it could be even in the stool. And if you have mucus in the stool, you are getting a really clear example of having a kapha imbalance. When we see stage 2, this is aggravation. This is when the problem is there for a little bit too long. And now things are getting worse because there's an accumulation of the doshas. So when vata is in good balance, it will help to move the energy through the body. And when it's out of balance, the energy stagnates. For example, inflammation will stagnate and accumulate in different parts of the body if vata cannot circulate energy properly. So things are going to get worse if these problems are ignored. And as the symptoms are worsening and that imbalance increases, we start to become less and less well. And we're still at a stage where we're perfectly functional, where we might not even really be paying attention to these things, to these sensations or symptoms. And yet it is the beginning of disease. And this will continue until we put our attention on how to make it stop. Spread is where things start to go in different parts of the body. So we saw that vata accumulates in the colon, but then vata can move in different parts of the body. So vata, for example, if it moves from the colon into the lower back, will cause back pain. And so we have a vata disorder that causes pain in the back or pain in the joints, for example. And so they leave their domain. Pitta will leave the intestine, for example. The pitta will spread through the body, causing inflammation and heat, possibly in the blood. Too much bile, an overheated liver that's not doing its job, inflammation of the skin, for example, inflammation of the joints. And so you get a kind of a rheumatoid arthritis. For example, as vata is building up in the colon, this might lead to constipation. Vata is dry, it's cool and dry and windy. And if you have frequent constipation, that can in and of itself cause low back pain because the body's not eliminating properly. And that causes an enormous amount of stagnant energy. And we need to keep things moving through the descending colon, especially to avoid that accumulation of vata. This is the phase where detoxing becomes absolutely necessary, and it gives really fast results. So when we detox from this phase, it's easy to reverse these problems. If we leave things a little bit later, that becomes more difficult. The infiltration stage is where Dr. Ladd would say, oh dear. Symptoms become localized as the accumulated doshas move into places where there is now ama, or this weakness in the body. Another way we could speak about ama would be chronic inflammation. So when ama has accumulated and we're not able to release that, as I mentioned earlier, the heat of pitta and the stagnancy of kapha and the irregularity or the instability of vata will produce a kind of a chronic inflammation. And this can be in all kinds of different aspects of our body. And that can provoke a weakness in the immune system. And because these changes are accumulating over time, we often think that these things are natural to getting older. So we think, oh, well, I have indigestion because naturally as I get older, my digestion gets weaker. Or I have aches and pains, but it's normal because I'm 50. Or, I don't remember things as well, or my brain is a little bit muddled, and that's normal because I'm getting older. And in fact, none of these things are normal and none of them are necessary. The fifth stage is manifestation. now we can see a qualitative change in our physical body. Now we can actually really see that there's something happening that is affecting our overall well-being. And this is where a Western medical doctor would say, oh, now you've got something. Now you've got an illness that they can measure and identify with some kind of blood test or some other type of measurement. Whereas prior to stage 5, they're not really too bothered. They're not really too interested in the symptoms. But Ayurveda is saying we must pay attention to these symptoms prior to these stages, where at this point it becomes hard to reverse. So when you go to the doctor with stage 5 manifestation, you end up with some kind of prescription or perhaps an invasive procedure. And if we want to do this from the point of view of Ayurveda, it's absolutely possible, but it will take time. It can take, for example, up to a year if you have a really strong case of inflammation, or if you have a really difficult problem with leaky gut, for example, or other kinds of digestive issues. And so that imbalance is hard to reverse, but it's not impossible. And that's the good news. It just takes commitment and time. And then at stage 6, we have an actual distortion of the body that will manifest in something that's really obvious, a tumor, for example. This would be, for example, if you've seen people who have serious arthritic problems, you see an inflammation of the joints, you'll see a deformation of the joints. This would be at this stage, at the 6th stage, which is really a chronicity of the illness that becomes almost impossible to reverse. Again, potentially possible to reverse, but we don't want to get to this stage because now this becomes a preoccupation and our quality of life suffers. We become more dependent on medicine or doctors or other people to live day to day. And this is where we find things like cancers, diabetes, autoimmune diseases of all kinds. And again, this is in the Western model, this is at the point at which they will identify this as illness, but not quite before, which is a great shame. This is Dr. Ladd's drawing of these 6 stages that I've just described. So if we start up at the top, on the upper left, you can see this kind of leaking tap. He's described it as a leaking tap. It's like, okay, it still functions. It's still okay. It might be dripping. It's no big deal. It's just dripping a little bit. But that's the problem that causes everything else. So this leaking tap is now provoking the imbalance of the dosha, the accumulation, sanchaya, which is moving toxins throughout the body, the spread, prasara, which is moving the doshas into parts of the body where the doshas should not really be. And as that dosha or that imbalance is moving through the body, it causes localized problems, especially, for example, in the sandhya points, in the joints, in the points of connective tissue. That's where we're going to find the biggest problems. And then eventually we're going to see destruction of tissue. Things are going to start to break down. And so we're really looking to work as much as possible throughout life at stages 1, 2, and 3, where we can really catch the little subtle imbalances of things that we can see every day are not functioning optimally, not yet ill, and yet potentially going to make us ill if we don't pay attention to it. And this is where the cleanse becomes a really wonderful tool for staying well. Ayurveda suggests seasonal and daily routines to maintain good health, long life, and spiritual growth. Ritucharya is a season. Acharya is like a mastery or understanding or working with something, so working with the seasons. And then dinacharya is the daily routine. Din is a day, mastering your day, looking out for the routines of the day. And notice that spiritual growth is mentioned here. So one of the main purposes of life, according to Ayurveda, is our spiritual growth. So we're not here just to be doing day-to-day householder things. We're also here as spiritual beings, and we're here to be happy and to explore that side of ourselves which is invisible to anyone else, which only we can relate to. So our good health is also a part of that spirituality. So our good health is physical, it's emotional, it's psychological, and spiritual. And Ayurveda takes care of all of that through various different means, whether it be meditation or mantra chanting, or of course the physical treatments of the body, as well as the different diets and things that we can do to help the body through exercise. And good health means regular bowel movements and good digestion, a feeling of being light and energetic, and clear eyes and clear skin. This is a really obvious outer manifestation of good health. But it's also having a good sense of self, having good discernment and intuition. Being able to trust one's instinct depends on having a healthy gut. As we say in English, you trust your gut. And you can't trust your gut if your gut is not functioning properly. So it's literally blocking our channels of perception if we are not functioning properly. And then good health also represents a feeling of basic contentment or santosha with life and being happy with life independent of outer circumstances. Whatever is going on in the world can be whatever it is, and it doesn't necessarily disturb your overall balance of happiness. Of course, your moods can fluctuate. That's not what Ayurveda is saying. In the same way as yoga or any other spiritual practice, we have an emotional connection to life as well. But the main thing is that it should not be predominant. It should not stagnate and not be overexcited. For example, stagnation of emotions would be kapha. Getting angry, getting upset, getting violent would be pitta. And then getting hyperactive or anxious or neurotic is vata. And if we see our lovely sadhu here, this is a gentleman that I encountered in Guptkashi in the Himalayas many years ago, maybe 15 years ago now. And I just was coming up from the basin of the tirtha of a temple there. And as I approached coming up the stairs, I just was so enchanted by his incredible radiance and this incredible glow that I took this photograph. And I was so really taken by his incredible energy, what we call ojas in Ayurveda. Ojas is vitality, it's an aura of well-being. And here he was, obviously, somebody in his, I'm going to say 60s, hard to say, but I would suggest he's in his 60s, and absolutely vibrant. And certainly at the time that I took that photograph, I felt he was 10 times as vibrant as I felt at that time. So I used this photograph both for myself to remember what ojas can look like in physical manifestation, as well as to demonstrate to others.